What's up everyone, Nader here. In this video, what I'd like to do is go over the element styles and classes in the DOM API in JavaScript together. There's quite a lot of stuff when it comes to styling that we can do with the DOM API. However, I do want to caution this is not a video about CSS or styling in general. What we're going to be looking at is specifically kind of the DOM API methods that allow us to manipulate styles in various ways, as well as actually classes that are going to be coming from an external style sheet most of the time. Let's take a look at what this looks like. All right, so to start, I just want to kind of start with an overview. So as I was hinting at earlier in the intro, I want to kind of think about elements and styles and classes in this context. So when you've looked at styling before, there's probably different ways that you've seen styling. When you first learn it, you probably have seen something called inline styling, right? Which is where you can do styling through the style attribute on an actual tag or an actual element in the DOM, right? And this works pretty well. It has its pros, it has its cons. There's also different priorities in which kind of gets applied first and the cascading nature of CSS. However, after a while, once you have a lot of styles, it gets kind of cumbersome to do inline styling. This has been brought more in vogue with kind of newer frameworks for styling like Tailwind, but that's a bit beyond the scope of this video since we want to really focus on the actual DOM methods independently. So inline styles are styles that we can kind of do directly as a style attribute on the actual element, very similar to any other attribute. And that's kind of what I'm hinting at with the style attribute here. However, in the previous video, we saw that there's also a style property, right? And that's when we get an actual element in the DOM API when we do something like query selector or get element by ID or something like that. And we can do like the dot style. We can access the different style properties that way. And we saw that there's kind of this way that we can kind of synchronize attributes and properties. And the same is going to be true for styles, which we'll see shortly. And I want to contrast this idea to just general style sheets. Now, this can be kind of in a head tag or somewhere else, or actually linked from an external style sheet. But these are kind of usually how you would think about doing styling. And I'm going to show you something cool that we can do through the DOM to actually get access to those. And most of the time, what we'll be doing when we're talking about styling as well is actually adding class names to different elements so that they can link to the external style sheet and the style sheet can then style those elements. And again, there's different kind of ways to approach this when it comes to CSS, because as we know, we can do it in an external file, in line, and a couple other ways. And hopefully this video helps kind of put a bit of those things in context. So to start, I want to actually talk about style sheets. So we've probably seen a CSS file, but I'm actually going to just do it even in line as a style tag in the head to show how this actually looks like. What's really cool about the DOM API is that we can actually access all of the style sheets, whether they're kind of in line in the head or they're actually externally linked through this property on the document called document.styleSheets. We can access all the CSS rules in there. We can even add our own rules and remove rules in there. So this is pretty cool. This is used by a lot of frameworks kind of behind the scenes. I just want to kind of start this up in code just so we can get our hands dirty and actually see what this looks like before we kind of continue with this idea of styling. So I'm going to switch back to VS Code over here. I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this styles.html. And in here, I'm going to create, just to kind of keep this consistent, I'll create my doc type HTML. I'll create my HTML tag, head tag. I'll just put a title and I'll just do styling in here. And then in the head, I'll have a body. And for now, maybe I'll do something like an H1 and I'll just say welcome to my blog. Okay. Now, usually we would see a link tag that links to an external style sheet, but just for demo purposes here, and this doesn't really matter where we put it related to the style tag, I'm just going to actually create a style tag here. And in here, I'm going to kind of style the H1 tag, right? So I'm going to say an H1, and they're going to have a style of, I don't know, let's say color, and let's just go with blue. All right. So we're saying style all the H1s in this document with the text color of blue. So if I right click this, I reveal it in Finder in my case, and let me zoom in a little bit here so we can see it, double click it to open it in Chrome, I'll zoom in super far here, we can actually see, and I'll open my DevTools along the side here, that this text actually is in blue, right? Which is exactly what we would expect. And that's coming from this style tag right here in the DOM, right? So notice that there's no class name, there's no nothing here. We just have one style tag, just like we would in a CSS file if we were to link to that externally. This is functioning the exact same. So if I come over to my console, check this out. This is pretty cool. I can actually do document.styleSheets, and I will get a list of all the style sheets on this document, right? Very similar to an array. And in this case, we only have one style sheet, which is the first style tag. If I create a second style tag or link to various style sheets, they would all appear in this array. If I open this up, we can see that in this case, it has a bunch of different properties. And if we open up the CSS rules property, that's also a list of all of the rules in this style sheet. In this case, there's only one rule, hence the 0 index at a length of 1. And if I open that up, we can see that there's some CSS text in here, which is an H1 color blue. There's some selectors. There's all sorts of really awesome stuff in here, and we can change these programmatically. Okay, I'm not going to go too deep through this because it's not as often that you would do this unless you're writing something like a framework or some other tools, for example, an extension for a web browser. But generally, hopefully you can see that we have programmatic access to all of the CSS style sheets and all of the rules from the DOM API through JavaScript in this case. Okay, so we can read, write these, delete these, update them, do whatever we want, which is pretty awesome. Okay, so let's kind of come in here really quick, and right before I switch, I just want to prove to you how cool this is. So I'm going to say document.styleSheets, and then I'm going to say at 0 in this case, since I only have one style sheet. So I'm going to grab the first style sheet. I'm going to say .add rule, and I'm going to add a selector in here. I'm going to just say an H1 as my selector, in this case, I'm going to add the style. Don't worry about the actual syntax for this. It doesn't really matter. I just want to show you what this looks like really quick before we move on. Again, usually we do this only in kind of extensions or as a framework. But if I say, for example, here I want to do a background, I'll just go with the shortcut here. So I'm going to do background color. Background of, let's do salmon. And this is going to look super, really greatly styled. And I press enter here. What we'll see is that now the background color for this is actually salmon, right? Which is pretty awesome. Now, if I switch back over to my Elements tab, you'll see that this actually is not here in this style sheet. But if I click on the H1, what you'll see is that it actually has, if we kind of scroll down to the styling section underneath the Elements tab, it has a background color and a text color as well. So there's definitely some nuances in here, and to kind of get too deep into this is kind of beyond the scope of this video, because the focus of this video is mainly the things that we're going to see day to day when we're working with styling, but just be aware that we can actually manipulate these through the DOM API and get access to them programmatically, which is super awesome. So let's keep going with this. These are the things that we're going to be seeing most often. Classes, right? When we're talking about classes, these are things that we want to actually give as names to different components, or I should say, HTML tags in our DOM, so that when we actually style them, we will actually have that style applied to those different elements, right? And many elements can share one class, which is a nice thing about classes, which makes them different from IDs. So an element has a class name attribute associated to it. Okay, so that, for example, if we had an image tag that looked like this in the actual HTML, and it had a class of large space lazy dash load, this is two classes in this case, large and lazy load, and we would see that entire string show up as a class name. Okay, so let me show you what I mean. If I switch back here to my console tab without doing anything to our HTML, and I say document.querySelector, and I'll grab that H1, and I'll say .className, what we'll see is an empty string, right? Which makes sense in this case because we didn't actually add any classes to this H1 tag. So let's change that. I'm going to go back to VS Code. I'm going to come to my H1. I'm going to just do those same classes in this case. I think over here I had large and lazy loads. Let's go with those. I'm going to say large and lazy dash load, right? So spaces kind of are the delimiter for different class names when it comes to the class attribute on element tags. But in this case, we would have two classes. Okay, so if I switch back to Chrome and I reload the page, what we'll see is my salmon color goes away because this only applied to that instance where I added the background color rule, but the blue still stays because that's part of the actual CSS rules at the top of the file. So now, if I come back and I run that same command, I'm going to get back that actual class name as a string, right? Large and lazy load. Now, check this out. There's also another attribute, classList. And if I run this, what we'll see is I get this thing called the DOM token list, which has some similarities to an array in JavaScript, and we can really treat it as an array. But really, there's two values in here. You can see that it's actually splitting this nicely for us based on kind of how classes work in JavaScript in general, and we're actually getting large and lazy load as separate classes. Right? So index 0 large, index 1 lazy load, hence the ordering here of the actual classes in our element, which is pretty awesome. So that's pretty cool, right? So we have access to this class list, and we can see everything in there. Class name will give us the whole string, which can be useful as well. But the nice thing about class list is that it actually has a bunch of methods on it. Very similar to how an array has things like push and pop and all that kind of stuff. We can do things on a class list because it's actually not really an array. It's an array-like data structure where we can do things like add, remove, replace, and toggle. So let's try this together in here. I'm going to say document.querySelector.h1.classList, and I'm going to say .add. I'm going to add the hello class. All right. Nothing happens in this case because if I just add a class by default, unless that's styled, we're not going to see any visual changes. But if I go back to my actual elements here, I'm going to see that now I have a hello class, right? So let me just show you why this is really useful before we even look at the other methods. So if I come back here and I say that I want to style anything with a hello class with a background color of, let's just say, salmon, okay? Let's see what actually happens. So I'm going to come back here. I'm going to reload this page. And notice that nothing happens in this case because we haven't added the class yet, right? So that class was added programmatically. So I'm going to say document query selector h1.classList.add hello. Let's see what happens to our actual element here. Okay, so 1, 2, and 3. And there we go, right? So now it's actually being styled because the browser is picking up that this actual hello class has a styling of background color, and it's going to apply the salmon background color to this dynamically, which is pretty awesome. So we can also remove classes. I can say document. Let me actually just do this so that you don't have to watch me type for too long. And I can say .remove, right? And I can remove, for example, let me see, which one did I have on here? I can remove the large class, for example, right? So that's removing large. And if I come back to my elements tab, you can see large is now gone, right? I can actually come in here and let me come back here. So we have large and lazy load. So we've seen add and remove. We can replace and we can toggle, okay? So if I come back to Chrome, I can say this, and I'll say .replace, and we want to replace one class with another. So I'll say I want to replace hello with the new class that I want to replace it with is maybe, let's go with monkey. And this is actually going to remove hello and add monkey in one step, right? So we should expect to see the salmon background color to disappear. Let's see if that's true. 1, 2, and 3, and it totally does. And if we switch back to the elements tab, we'll actually see that we have lazy load and monkey as our classes, which is pretty great. The last one I want to show you before we move on is toggle. So we can say .toggle, and toggle will take a class name and actually basically remove it if it exists and add it if it doesn't exist. So for example, I can toggle the chosen, for example, and in this case, we're going to see that chosen gets added. And if I toggle it again, if I run the same code one more time, we'll see a little bit cut off on my head there, but hopefully you see that it was toggled. Now it's actually gone from this list. So we can toggle it on and off actually, instead of adding and removing and forgetting which state that we were in. So that is pretty awesome, right? Very powerful tools in order for us to dynamically add and remove classes. We can actually use className and we can kind of change this manually. However, it's much easier to actually work with a class list because you can accidentally overwrite all the previous classes if you don't do this properly and you forget to, for example, concatenate the string. Okay, so let's keep going with this. The next thing I want to show you is how inline styles work when it comes to the style attribute and then the associated style property. So when I'm talking about inline styles, I want you to think about something like this right here. So under the style attributes, what I have is, for example, an image, which has an ID attribute of hero, but most importantly here, it has a style attribute inline in the image where it's assigning both a color of green and a top of 10 pixels. Okay, this is actually not going to do anything in this case because unless the position is set, but that's totally fine. It's just an example. So what's really awesome about this is that very similar to the attributes like ID that we saw previously, we can actually access style as a property in the DOM API for that element. So just to be super explicit what's happening here, this over here in green on the left is the HTML tag. Okay, it has an attribute for style that is setting the color to be green and the top to be 10 pixels. This here on the right is in JavaScript as any other regular object. We're getting this from something like query selector, for example. In this case, I'm kind of cheating using the ID, and you should really generally never do this. But just to show you how that would work, if I grab the element, imagine this is query selector, and I do .style on it, I can get access to its actual styling. So I can change the color that way, and I can change the top that way, and many other styles as well. Now, I want to show you a demo of this really quick, but before I do, I want to mention a couple of key points. When we are doing things that require units, make sure to actually include the units. So you can see that I have pixels here, px, which is what it's short for. We can use other things like rem or em, but most of the time, if you end up not including the units, you're not going to get the expected behavior, or that style is going to be ignored completely. Okay, so make sure you actually include the units explicitly. Also, some styles, for example, background color are background dash color, just like this over here when you're actually writing them in CSS or as an attribute. And if you want to access things like that in a JavaScript object syntax, which is what the style property is of an object, we're going to be using camel case. So for example, background dash color would be background color in camel case like this in the actual style property for that attribute version itself. All right. And the nice thing here is that these actually sync back and forth. So let me show you what I mean. If I actually switch back to Google Chrome, let me just reload this so that we start with a fresh slate. We have h1 class large, lazy load, and then in here we have our style of h1 color and a hello as our class, which we're not using right now. Okay, so it's only blue is the style that it has right now. So if I come back in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say document.querySelector. I'm going to grab that h1. Okay. Then what I can do is I can say .style .background color, just like that, right? Notice the camel case because as an object, I can't do background dash color. That's not a legal JavaScript property name. So I have to camel case this background color. And if I do salmon like this, let's check out what happens. 1, 2, and 3. And there we go. We get our salmon color back. All right. And if I switch back to the Elements tab, take a look at this, right? I have now added this attribute for an inline style, style equals background color salmon, just as if we had added it as an attribute manually, right? So that's kind of what I was trying to show here. When we're changing this property, it's going to sync to the attribute and vice versa as well. When I change the attribute, it's going to sync to the property. So let me show you what I mean there. So if I come back to Chrome in this HTML, I can actually change this. So I'm going to just right click, edit the attribute, I guess. And in here, I'm going to say after background color of salmon, let's do like a margin of, I don't know, let's do like 50 pixels, just like that. All right. And I'm going to add a semicolon as well. And what we expect to see, now I put a whole bunch of pixels just so it's super explicit, is we're going to expect on the top, bottom, left, and right, the margin to kind of squish this text inward a little bit, just so that we can see that change. And then we want to check to see if this actually shows inside the actual style property. So I'm going to try this. I'm going to press enter, 1, 2, and 3, and there we go. And you saw the text kind of shift around because now it's actually 50 from the top and 50 from the left and the right and bottom as well. So if I switch back to my console here and I try to do .style what did I say, margin, we'll see that margin has been set now to be 50 pixels, and we change that on the attribute and it syncs to the property. And we just saw the reverse earlier as well, where we changed the property and it synced to the attribute. And that is pretty awesome, right? So just to really confirm, if I scroll down here and I choose my H1 and I look at the styles in the bottom under the elements tab, we'll see that it has a background color, it has a margin, and then it has our regular color for the text from our actual style sheet. And it has all the default styles from our Chrome and our operating system, which is pretty awesome. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, I want to show you something interesting. If we actually think about what's happening here, there's a really tricky concept when it comes to CSS. Right? CSS is actually built on the idea of cascading. That's where the name comes from. CSS, cascading style sheets. Now, what would happen if we add attributes to our element and then we try to actually also add styles into our style sheets? Are our attributes going to actually show the styles in our style sheets? So let's see what I mean by this. So if I come back here, we can see that our H1 has a color of blue, right? But notice, color of blue, right, is not inside of this style attribute. The only things that are in this style attribute are background color of salmon, right? This background color right here, as well as a margin of 50 pixels around all sides, right? The style of color blue is actually coming from over here, which is the style sheet. Okay, in this case, we only have one style sheet, but it is a style sheet nonetheless. It is not an attribute. So let's see what happens. I want you to think about this. If we actually ask for query selector of H1, and then we try to grab the color property off the styles object, what do you think we'll see? Will we see blue as we're visually seeing, or will we see something else? All right, so let me come back here. I'm going to do that. I'm going to say, I'm going to grab this entire H1. I'm going to grab the style attribute or style property. And on the style property, we expect to see a color, color. And I'm going to press enter. And it's an empty string. So it looks like it's just the default. So what is happening here? Clearly it's blue. Right? It's not just black, which is the default. So why is this happening? Well, the answer is that because of how CSS works, there's actually multiple places where we can actually add styles, and where we place them actually makes a difference when it comes to the priority or the importance of those styles. So for example, check this out. If I set this .color equal to, let's go with another color. I don't know, what's another color I can use? I'll just say, let's just go with black. Not how you spell black. We'll just go black like that. I'm going to press enter and notice that the text changes to black, right? So if I come to my elements tab here, we'll see that this has been added as an inline attribute style, right? Color black. But this color here is still blue for an H1, right? So hopefully now you're starting to see why this would be the case, because an inline style takes precedence over a style sheet style. because we can actually create another H1 without this color attribute, and it would actually inherit this H1 style from the style sheet, right? So just to really show you that, I'm going to come in here, I'm going to do edit as HTML, and I'm going to put another H1 tag, and I'm going to say hello. And I'm just going to click out here so it saves. And notice that this H1 over here, right, is blue because it doesn't have any attributes that are overriding the default styles from the style sheet. So this is why it was an empty string before, because it only grabs attributes when we're using the style property on an element. Okay, so then the question becomes, well, that's great, but how do we find what the real actual color is, right? Or what the real padding or margin or all that stuff is, right? Surely, if there's a way to grab the attributes, there's a way to actually figure out what the real visual CSS actually is for that element. And thankfully, the answer, as most things, is yes, there is a way to do that. And that is what's called the getComputedStyle API or function that's part of the DOM. So let me show you how this works. I have some HTML here on the left. In this case, you can see that there's a head. In there, we have a style. In this case, I'm styling a paragraph background of salmon. And in the body, I have the same paragraph, or not the same paragraph, I have a paragraph, and it has an inline style of color blue for the text with some text of welcome. So on the right here, what I have is kind of what we were looking at, right? In this case, with a paragraph instead of an H1. I'm going to grab that paragraph because it's the first one on the page. And if I access the color property off the style property, what we'll see is blue because that's an actual attribute. So we have an attribute property sync. So that's going to show blue. But if I try to grab p.style.background, that is not an attribute. That is coming from CSS, from the style sheet. So we're actually going to get an empty string. Okay. So the way that we can actually see that the style for this paragraph actually is salmon, right? Because it actually is going to be salmon visually on our screen because it's going to inherit this style. We can use getComputedStyle, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's going to actually perform the entire CSS cascade for us, just like the browser would, and actually figure out what the real styling is, regardless of whether it's coming from the attribute or inline or from a style sheet, or if it's got the important tag or something like that. Okay, so we can do getComputedStyle. This is a global function available to us off of the window object that's part of the DOM API, and we can actually pass it a node, or in this case, an element, HTML element. And it's going to give us back a huge object with all of the styles, very similar to the style property over here. So if I access styles.color, check this out. Instead of blue, which is kind of the colloquial name, we actually get the real RGB style, right? Red, green, blue, 0 for red, 0 for green, and 255, which is the max for blue, which is what this shorthand string actually evaluates to when it's processed by the CSS engine. Okay, and also check this out. When we actually do styles.background, and again, styles is the computed styles for the paragraph tag in this case. We do styles.background, we get RGB now instead of an actual empty string of what the salmon color ends up being as an RGB value, which is these three values for red, green, and blue combined. All right, so let's come back here to our Chrome and let's take a look at what we can do with this. So now, if I actually try to, you know what? Let me refresh this page here, and if I come back to my elements over here, let's just kind of take a look at where we are. So we have H1 color blue. That's coming from the style sheet, right? So it's not coming from an inline style. Okay. So if I do document.querySelector.h1.style.color, we're going to get an empty string because color is not an attribute inline style for our H1. That's coming from the style sheet. But if I do this, I'm going to say I'm going to say getComputedStyle, and I'm going to pass it document.querySelector h1. Okay, and you can see when I do this, it's going to actually give me a CSS object. Let me just show this to you really quick, right? Look at how big this object is. I don't know if you can really see this, but if I kind of expand this, look at how gigantic this object is. It's pretty large. There's a lot of different styles in there, and they all have different kind of properties and variables, and this will change depending on the browser, and we have access to all of them. Okay, so I don't want to actually look at all of them in this case. Why am I clicking around like this? Oh my goodness. I'm going to switch back in here. I just wanted to minimize this. Can I minimize it? There we go. And I want to run this again, but instead I want to actually just directly grab the color property off of this. And if I do that, what we'll see is blue, right? This is red, green, blue values, 0 for red, 0 for green, and 255, which is the max for an 8-bit integer for blue, right? Which is pretty awesome. And just to compare, if I compare this to this, this is where the difference is. We have to compute the style for our H1 in this case, because it's coming as a cascade from the CSS style sheet, and our style attribute is only looking at attributes on the actual tag. Okay, and this applies to everything that gets computed, including all things like spacing and all the cascades for different colors and text effects and all that kind of stuff. We can actually get access to those through getComputedStyle if we need to know the actual style that's not in the attribute. We're going to make ample use of this as we go forward. Super useful to know in pretty much every context when you're working with web development. So I hope you found this set of kind of information valuable. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. What we're going to do in the next video together is go through a bunch of exercises to actually get more practice with this idea of styling through attributes and through classes, and also getComputedStyle and what the differences between all these different concepts. There's a lot of fun things we can do with styling, and now that we can get more visual with the browser, we can add this idea of styling. I can't wait to get to those exercises. I'll see you in those ones. See you later.